January this past year, and I've been working on the development of ethics in education now for about 3 years or so. Currently, I am a registrar at Medford High School, which is just a few towns over, and this is my first year in that position. Over 3 years while I was working on my master's, I was a substitute teacher. I had a great opportunity to co-teach a web design course where I was able to work on an ethics supplement. And the purpose of this presentation today is to go into detail about how ethics that we've learned about at the master's level could be applied to the high school level. So working with kids, especially since so many people think that it's very underdeveloped at that level. So first off, I want to thank Suffolk University, the Ethics and Public Policy program, for having me back. It means a lot that I can come and share how the knowledge has really benefited me in my life, and it means a lot that you guys want to have me back. So without further ado, this is the abstract that Professor Platts here asked for me to post up. So where does ethics fit in the student-teacher relationship? Answers found in theory, curriculum development, and classroom experience. My focus is always on the student-teacher relationship. There are so many different opinions on education, but at the end of the day, it comes down to teachers teaching students and students learning to the best of their ability. So that's where I focus. And moving on to a more helpful agenda, we're going to start with a lecture on theory. And there's a wide background in the audience right now of what you have experienced ethics-wise in terms of your own education, all the way up to PhD students, and then my friends from Medford, who are all distinguished alumni from other programs, but may not have the ethics background. The curriculum proposal is really going to be the description of the work that I've done over the last few years, and then classroom examples to kind of back up why the curriculum proposal is the way it is. And then at the end, if we have time, we can talk about taking next steps together, because developing ethics in high school education is definitely going to take a lot of collaboration in the future. It's not something that can just be kind of initiated by an individual and hope that it all works out. So thanks for coming to be a part of that. So an intro to ethics. At the high school level, it's very common to have students and teachers know the word ethics and be familiar with the term. But because it's never been put inside of a curriculum or academic context before, they can't really come up with a solid definition. At the beginning of the class I've been teaching this year, I was like, oh, well, what do you think of when you think about ethics? And synonyms that students and teachers came up with were morality, philosophy, values, principles, standards, virtues, all of them very close, but it doesn't have any type of pedagogy behind it to just throw up a bunch of vocabulary terms. So you really need to have something that enables you to go a whole course year with enough structure. So the definition that I provide at the beginning, and then we slowly realize why we use these terms, but I think of ethics as the study of actions and their consequences on the self, others, and institutions. But an important point, especially with high school kids, is if you were to search ethics in just a simple Google search, you get over 140 million results. And that just goes to show that my definition is one of millions. So not to say that this is something that every high school program or college program should use as a definition, it's just something that I find very useful. And to take a step further, we have to put ethics in a historical context. It's a word that people use and hear every day, but where did it come from? So moving on, historical context, it's always best to put that into a timeline. And to bookend the timeline, obviously there's tons of material. It starts with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, which I had the good fortune of learning about Professor Fried right here, circa 500 BC, and it's framed around the idea that they're credited with the development of Western thought, and I'll go into more detail about that. At the most recent bookend, we have the Kohlberg theory of development, which is a pretty well-founded theory in education. Again, I'm going to go into more detail about it, but it started at Harvard University in the 1950s and has gone on to influence a lot of different social science initiatives. But the most up-to-date research, using it to empirically analyze ethics in education, it's been applied to social media and something that's definitely heavily influenced my career. So, development of Western thought. The three main guys, students and teachers themselves, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. This slide is something that I show to high school students often just because I think it's important that they see the names of these men and know the quotes that they are relatively famous for. So, as for me, all I know is that I know nothing. Very interesting term, especially to pose to a high school student, but ultimately without going through Plato's entire writing, you could say that, or I like to say anyway, that Plato is the best at asking why. When he was in his time, he encountered a lot of individuals who had tremendous power and influence over society, and he was the best at challenging those individuals and making them question the reasons that they did things because he could ask why and engage in conversation, and that's where he came up with the Socratic method, and it led to a lot of interesting discussions. And his student, Plato, who was the guy that wrote everything down. Something that is great to tell high school students is that Socrates didn't believe in writing anything. Like, whenever they're doing homework assignments, things like that, it's great to think that the leading development in Western thought was by someone who didn't write anything down. So luckily he had his student, though, Plato, who answered the why with reason. And you come up with a dialogue, basically, where Socrates asked why, then he would have a reaction, another why, and it leads to a debate. And internally it could be the reason within yourself or the reason within a group of people, but basically answering why with reason. And then Plato's student Aristotle built on that reason with empiricism. Because as good as it is to have a back and forth and talk about different subjects to, at great length, to have empirical evidence to support a statement or fact, it's just the next step in developing an argument or building on reason with something that could be said as a fact. And I always try to say that it's important to look at this as a cycle, because it doesn't end with empiricism. Any fact can then again be challenged with why. But when you're looking at like a cycle of thought, this is a great way to look at it, just why, reason, and empiricism. So that's the introduction to ethics that it usually takes a class to lead into this, and it influences every other class that I've taught at Member High School. The next class that I would teach is about the Kohlberg theory of ethical development. One of the few things that I didn't get from this program, again, it came from Harvard University, and specifically a woman, Carrie James, who was working there in social media efforts to empirically look at how students are behaving online. And the Kohlberg theory says pretty generally that from age 0 to 2, an individual doesn't have much understanding at all of their actions and the consequences of those actions on themselves or other people, things like that. It's not until between the ages of around 2 or 5 that a child will really understand the consequences of their actions on themselves. So it could be as simple as like touching a hot stove and realizing that no, you're not supposed to do that, but it could be as complex as crying or just reaching out to parents, things like that, and understanding what the response is that you're going to get from the environment that you're in. When you get a little bit older, between the ages of 5 to about the 12 years old, the beginning of puberty really, all of these age groups are pretty loosely defined. You can, I don't think there's anybody there, like any 2-year-olds with ethical thinking yet, but again, these are just kind of basic frames for the age groups. But between the ages of 5 and 12, you start to understand the cause and effect of your actions on other people. So your parents, your friends, your classmates, your teachers, these are all people who are in groups that you associate with. So the moral thinking is if someone starts to develop, it's like, oh, what will my actions affect other people with? And that's something that is really only developed until the beginning of puberty. From the start of puberty until roughly adulthood, I'm 26 years old and I still don't really feel comfortable calling myself an adult, but until roughly adulthood, that's when you develop what is known by Kohlberg as ethical thinking and understanding the cause and effect on institutions. So it's beyond groups, but it's cause and effect on something like the healthcare system or the legal system. Just basically abstract institutions that you can't really fault a 12-year-old for not understanding their actions and whether or not something was illegal or something like that. But you expect an adult to understand that, and they develop that normally according to consequence thinking, moral thinking, and ethical thinking over their developmental periods. And there are theories that people skip steps, but it's hard to understand that someone would develop ethical thinking and understand institutions before they understood the consequences on themselves, or moral thinking before themselves, things like that. So it generally goes in this order. And using those 2 bookmarks, we can kind of say that, okay, that's ethics at if you're in day 3 of teaching a class, that kind of bookends everything really well. And then you can point to basically all of this course material. These are all the books that come from the Ethics Public Policy program, 701 and 702. And I brought them here today just to show you that if you ever thought oh, ethics is underdeveloped in high school education, where are we going to find material for all of this? There's so much material. The pragmatism book was actually part of a separate lecture that we had, just one afternoon. I think other students were interested, and we got into that book, but pragmatism goes into detail a lot with empiricism and taking pragmatic action, but we'll get to that. So, practical use for all of this information. It's one thing to just talk about this type of stuff, but to really develop it in a practical sense for high school education. 21st century learning goals are a term that get thrown around high schools pretty often. There are endless lists of these things. They vary by state and nationally, but we have to figure out how we're going to apply the ethical development to 21st century learning goals. The reason I think that it's underdeveloped in high school education now is that in the 1950s and really all the way through the 70s, people had civics courses that they attended, and it developed the concept of the citizen. But when the federal government started to really invest money, starting in the 1950s all the way up to when I was in middle school, they really emphasized putting funding behind tangible results. And it was a lot easier to show that a student was learning a mathematical concept, a scientific concept, or historical information by testing them and showing that they had learned the information, as opposed to something ethical, which is a lot more abstract. So contemporary research is enabling you to empirically measure ethical results, and that's why I think 21st century learning goals are going to be a lot more adaptable to an ethical education.
Well, say that again? I don't understand what's changed from this quantitative model of how to assess education that's making this situation better.
Right, so the model hasn't changed, but the ability to empirically measure ethics has changed. So now you, or at least what I'm going to go into detail about, is that you can actually demonstrate that a student has learned an ethical concept, where before in your civics class you couldn't say that, oh, someone is a better citizen now that they took my course. But using the information that I'm going to go into detail about, I think we now have the ability to do that, which suits ethics for 21st century learning goals. So, applicable thought processes to apply in real-world situations. So just a little summary: the why, reason, empiricism cycle, consequence, moral, and ethical thinking, and then that's how we wound up with the definition that I showed to you in the earlier slide. Moving on from there. As far as curriculum development is concerned, my own experience is teaching basically 1 full year in a web design course as an ethics supplement, and then I was able to get to class 1 so far over the current school year. We've only been there for a month or so. But this is how I always start the process, and it's very similar to what I've been talking about here today. Class 1, an introduction to ethics, I start with a lecture that basically talks about the bookend at a very minimal level. I don't even go into the full consequence, moral, ethical thinking, or why, reason, empiricism for a whole lot. But that's because I found that sometimes students can find that material dry. Don't fault them for it. But it's so important to start the first class of the year with your best presentation. So something that I've presented on a lot is social media in education. And it's kind of my strongest presentation to give to high school students. And I find that it's relatively interesting for them. We can have a good discussion. And that way I know when I'm starting out the semester, it's going to be a good one. And that way, maybe class number 2, they'll still be a little bit more interested, and we kind of get through it. And I structure it with an introduction to ethics. I begin with the lecture, then the social media and education, there's a corresponding video, which is always a nice break in the lecture. It's important not to just talk to students for 56 minutes, which is how long the periods are at Medford High. But after the video, with maybe a half an hour left in class, we go into the Western thought experiment, and that's basically group work that has kids try to apply these different things. And I'm going to go into more detail about what exactly a Western thought experiment is later. But based on that experiment, we go to class 2 the next time we meet, which I think will be late October for this current year. But we build on class number 1 with Kohlberg theory. So everything they talk about in the first class, we start to think, okay, remember when we talked about this particular situation? Now apply consequence, moral, and ethical thinking to it. So whatever they came up with results from the first experiment, they can now frame it a bit more with Kohlberg theory. Class number 3 builds more with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. It's just adding another thought process for them to really use as a skill, I guess, to analyze case studies, different prompts, things like that that are described in the experiment. And then class number 4 and beyond, it's kind of just applying those first 3 classes to whatever the course material is. So right now I'm teaching a web design course, and it's really great. I wish that Medford High offered a computer programming class, web design, when I was a student. But there's so many different ethical considerations that web design lends itself very well to figuring out, oh, well, how does this affect institutions in my lives or different groups? But that definitely applies to other areas as well. With web design, we, again, talk about social media education, but there's issues like internet surveillance, net neutrality, a description of social networks, where we actually have a class exercise where kids will map out their own social network using, Wolfram Alpha is great for analyzing Facebook posts and things like that. There's so many tools out there that help kids kind of get a context of what they're doing online. So we talk about social networks, then something that relates all the way back to Socrates with a class called Know Thy Selfie. That was definitely my favorite. It's also cool. The actor James Franco wrote a thesis on the selfie, and like he's very well known for taking pictures and posting them to Instagram and Twitter, and he has a lot of really developed thoughts about the selfie, and they lend themselves really well to a high school class, and you can tie in a lot of early ethics education things there. And then big data and data journalism is something that we're doing for the first time this year because the class has partnered with the Boston Globe to develop an app that basically targets students on what they're interested in news and bringing that into their community. So just another great application of ethics to a web design curriculum. But it's not hard to imagine how you could take this class structure and put it towards science, math, or history. Science, if you take any scientific fact and then pose the why, reason, empiricism thought process to it, it just gives kids, not so much based on the scientific method, but a real ethical way to interpret scientific understanding. It's great to apply to issues surrounding climate change. It's like if you say, oh, how does climate change affect your life? And the student has to figure out how it affects themselves as an individual, the groups that they belong to, and then the institutions that they belong to. It's something that they've never really structured before, and it really leads to a richer understanding of something as complex as climate change that before you could talk about wind chain patterns and all sorts of temperature rises, things like that. But this puts it in an ethical sense that I think is a lot more relatable for high school kids. Math is definitely trickier. I have friends who teach math, and they say, oh yeah, you can totally do it. One thing that I always like to pose to students is one of Euclid's theorems that if one thing is equal to another, oh my god, why is it escaping me now? If two things are similar to one thing, then those two things are similar to themselves. And that was something that Abraham Lincoln used to pose as evidence to show that slavery and racism is actually a really unethical or even scientifically and mathematically illegitimate way of thinking, that two things, if they're equal to one thing, they're equal to each other. It's just something that even math is applicable to ethics. And history is the easiest thing. You could go to any important historical event and put it in this ethics framework, and it leads to a richer understanding of what was just before a bunch of facts that went out through that go on throughout history that you're supposed to memorize. So that's as a class supplement, and that's as far as I've been able to get in my own teaching career, which has been a great opportunity. I love working with different teachers. As a substitute, I got to go into classrooms, and any day it could be a physics class, it could be a history class, or even special ed, things like that, and you can apply the ethics framework. But it's important to have a full course load, and that's what I think the ethics department here is really interested in. How can you design a full class in Massachusetts, 180 days of teaching material, and structure it so that high school kids get enough out of it. And this is the structure that I've come up with. So Medford High School uses a quarter system. Right now we're in first quarter, and if you were to be teaching a full class, you would basically do the real academic context of ethics. So you would have the same 3-class introduction, and then applying it to all the different writers and any ethical writer who you think would be important. And it helps the students understand that there's a rich history of academic information out there to apply towards ethics. And if you can get through even just a couple of these books in a quarter at the high school level, I think you're making a big step in the development of ethics at that level. But it's, I think, too much to go through an entire school year and only have students reading books. So where in the first quarter you learn ethics as a subject, second quarter you could start to develop ethics as a skill. So instead of putting it into whatever context you're talking about, you can start to say, oh, in your own life, how do these ethical situations apply? And really work with students to help them think about these things in their day-to-day lives. So social media is the best way to do it, thinking about the consequences of the self, the other people that you're with, and the institutions that you're working with, that you're a part of, and what those actions really mean. This is what I look at as a pragmatic step, because social media at the high school level is a very serious issue. We had policies up until this very school year that said students aren't allowed to use social media. That was the policy at Medford High School. And everyone broke it. Students and teachers, everyone had profiles, but it was just something that went ignored. And as long as Medford High had the profile, had that policy, then they could just ignore student behavior and say, oh, they're not supposed to do it, but if we don't see them doing it, then that's just the way it is. So luckily they've changed that, and taking pragmatic steps is very important. I have the case study method of learning up here. It's another well-founded theory in education, and it's basically looking at, if you were saying a historical sense, looking at specific events in history and applying this case study method. And then you're just applying the ethical framework in a case study method. So that's just kind of a buzzword that goes over well in educational circles to say that you're going to be applying the case study method in ethics as a skill, and I think it would very much help carry the quarter too. But moving on to the second half of the year, you want to talk about applied skills. And that's where community service, I think, is going to play a huge role in the next decade or so at the high school level. Right now, and when we were even in high school, Medford High had a great policy of requiring students to complete 160 hours of community service every year. And it sounds like a lot, but students do it. It's not the most well-regulated thing, so like some kids will lie or whatever. But it's really making students go out into their community and engage with like other people and make their town or whatever a better place to live. If you were to put this in an academic context during like an everyday class, it's just a focused application of that, and you can use the ethical framework to really say, oh, like, what do you find interesting? What do you want to serve? And then as far as the groups are concerned, who would you then begin serving? And then what are the institutions that would then benefit from that type of applied skills? So you have ethics as a subject, then you learn how to use it as a skill, and then you actually use it as a skill in the third quarter. Fourth quarter, I didn't really know how to address that. I think this works a lot better in threes, but it's also really important in education, obviously, to have a review and to be able to justify what you had been learning and teaching the students. So you need to conduct some sort of empirical analysis. And I'm going to provide some survey results of students that I taught over last year. But as far as standardized tests are concerned, we went into it a little bit before, but using the Kohlberg theory, you can, I think, legitimately show that if a student at the beginning of the year never considered an institutional consequence of their actions, whereas the end of the year they are starting to consider the institutional consequences, then you can say that they have ethically matured. And that's an empirical way of saying so. So if you were to give someone a standardized test where they're writing a response, and it says, how would you consider this situation? If they can write an essay where they consider the self, others, and then institutions in their lives, you can say that they've learned something over the course of a year. And that's an empirical way to say that someone's become more ethical. And that's, only really realized today. It was based on, like I said, that woman Carrie James research, and it's something that I try to apply in everyday class setting. So, break, I meant to take that slide out because, let's see, it's 1:30, so nobody needs a break, right? Nah. Maybe me, I'll tough through it. All right. So, classroom examples. SurveyMonkey is a great resource, even though it has a ridiculous name. It's what I use to basically test students and, oh goodness. Sorry, I should have queued this up before. All right, it worked. Okay, so I'm going to show you an assessment that I did last year. Let's see, the first one right here. And this was with a group of seniors in my web design course. And it was after the first 3 classes. We had gone over all this material, I posted it online. And then I gave the students a whole period to basically go through and answer these very simple questions. So first we see that we had 8 students and then 1 teacher, Ms. Goldsberry, who I've been co-teaching with, go through this survey. First question, Socrates is associated with what development in Western thought? So who can tell me right off the bat from those answers you see on the side there?
Asking why.
Asking why, exactly. So you think after 3 classes and, multiple hours of explaining this and a lot of effort, that more than a third of the students would have been able to get that right as well, especially when they have full access to, like I said, guys, use your computers to figure out this stuff. Like go to the course website and you can see the answers right there. And I think a lot of this had to do with, the class is unfortunately at 7:50 in the morning, and like I wouldn't want to give this presentation at 7:50 and then answering questions on it. Like you're just not going to get the best results. But still, it shows that students' answers were all over the place, and that was one of the best ones because then you get to Plato's. Oh, where'd it go? Let's see. Plato is associated with what development in Western thought? What did I just talk about? It was moral thinking. Only one person got it right. And this was, again, at the beginning of the year after 3 classes. But I don't know if I just made the questions that were too confusing. I don't really think so. But they didn't do so great on this first assessment. And then they screwed themselves up because Aristotle is associated with what development in Western thought? They already said empiricism for other answers, so they knew that couldn't be it, and they threw themselves off for that question as well. But it goes through that. What else do we have here? It's just more testing, and they did relatively well, but it shows that, you know, they, even after a few lectures, the material didn't really sink in totally. These are some hypothetical prompts that come at the end. We're going to get into it later, but I'm going to go to an assessment that we did at the end of the year. Let's see. Final group assessment. And it's a little bit better. That is, you are at the whim of technology every time you try to do this stuff. I don't know how I would teach ethics in a non-modern classroom. Like, it would just be me up there lecturing and hoping students were engaged in the material enough. But luckily we have these tools today. But look at that. Socrates associated what development Western thought? A bunch of them figured it out. But this is just to show that you can empirically prove that kids are learning ethical material. Again, these are just very simple, questions with corresponding answers, and it's the same thing that you consider if it was like memorizing facts in history. But the real rich information comes at the end in these responses. And to spare you guys going through paragraph by paragraph, I'd be very happy to share this information with you. But these are paragraphs full of students taking prompts, taking a lesson that we had from the year, and trying to apply it to themselves, others, and then institutions. The writing is just a lot richer, and it shows that they learned something over the course of a school year. And this was only 16 sessions over, 10 months of learning. So it wasn't very, constant access to this information. Also, it was a significant point that none of the work that I assigned to them was going to be graded. Again, this was just a supplement that I was kind of helping out a teacher who had to go to a class once a week, so I would step in every once in a while. And I said up front, kids, I'm not going to grade you on any of this stuff, but we're just going to kind of see how it works into your own thinking. And, even without a grade incentive to learn the material, they still picked it up, and they still found it interesting enough that they could at least apply it in some way. So that was very encouraging, and I'd be happy to meet with anybody after this to go over it in more detail. But let's get back to the presentation. All right. So, workshops. Let's see, what do we got for 135? Okay, so I designed these workshops to kind of basically take up time during this presentation, but I talked earlier about the Western thought experiment, and that was one of the first lesson plans. It's something that occurs commonly throughout the year, and it was pretty straightforward. I would just try to assess technology's effect on human learning. And what I would do is separate students into 4 groups. Group 1 with computers, it was about 8 or 10 students. Group 2, again, 8 or 10 students, but without computers. Then 1 student with a computer, and 1 student without a computer. And you would give them the same prompts and have them analyze it with the tools at their disposal. So in the group thinking with computers, they came up with very empirical answers to the prompts that I gave them. They were able to go online, still talk about the prompt, but then find solid information to back up whatever it was, the reason that they had come up with. Group 2 didn't have that same access to technology, so their answers to the prompts were much more based in reason, whatever they were able to come up with in their own dialogue. Still very significant, and they came up with a lot of interesting things that weren't empirical, but just as important to include in the conversation. But it just shows that technology does have an effect on human learning. It's different. And then the student alone with just a computer came up with a list, but it wasn't nearly as creative as what the group of students with computers came up with. And then the student without a computer, they were left to sit there and reason about the prompt, but very often they came up with the best. It was like, Mr. Tuden, why am I doing this? This is so silly. I'm just sitting here by myself. Why? I don't want to be in this group next time we do it. So that was always very encouraging. But it was just a great way to incorporate whatever we wanted to learn that particular day and have a regular structure that the kids would be familiar with and know what was expected of them, but still come up with unique results at the end of the day. And that's the structure of the Western thought experiment. And again, it would be based on hypothetical situations or prompts. The best prompt that I ever came up with was, what rights do human beings have? And students would, with the computers, go online and they'd find the United Nations Bill of Rights, and it would be a list of 22 things that they never even knew that they had the right to have internet access. It's a very novel thing. It's something that the group without computers didn't come up with. They would say like the pretty straightforward stuff about freedom of speech or freedom of religion, right to assembly, stuff like that, if they even got that far. But you know, they didn't have an empirical list of rights that they would then know were guaranteed to them by some institution out there. The group without computers, though, they came up with like different things. They said they had the right to dress how they wanted, or you know, they would joke around and say, "Oh, we have the right to eat French fries," or you know, things like that. So again, it's not the empirical and you know, solid information that you get from a prompt, but again, it's just important reason that is, and it's explained by the why, reason, empiricism thought process. And the students with the computer, if they were lucky enough to know what the United Nations was at the time, then maybe they came up with that, but it was very common to get the Bill of Rights. But again, it's just not as very material because they didn't have access to the group. And then again, the student is like, I have the right not to participate or something like that. So that's literally what a kid said to me. So that was the best one. It can also be applied to hypothetical situations. We use this as students, but I also do this with professional development as far as teachers are concerned, because they need to be educated about all this material just as much as the kids do. And it would mostly be a part of social media workshops where I would take literal situations that Medford High School has encountered. I manage the school's Twitter account, and you know, a few students at the beginning of this were like, "Oh yeah, you can follow me, Mr. Tuden, that's fine." And I think they didn't really consider it because it's just incredibly inappropriate. So first off, I like to ask teachers, how would you respond to a student who wanted to connect via social media? So, you know, nothing inappropriate's happened yet, but you just have this great potential of all of a sudden we have this online relationship, we don't know what to think about it, so you now have these two thought processes to help yourself through that. So first, like the why would I connect to this student is important, like, and you can answer that yourself however you want. And like these match up relatively well. I don't like to tie them together concretely, but the why and the consequence thinking, it's like, well, why would I want to be this student's Facebook friend? It's like, oh, well, I like this student, so yeah, of course I would just check that off. Or like, you know, it's just as important to say, oh, I don't like this student, I don't want them to see my Facebook information. So that's a very legitimate thing to think. But then if you move on to the next process, moral thinking, well, you know, this student is a part of a group. Like, he's in my class, I should probably be familiar with this information. Even though I don't like him, I gotta consider that we are like tied together in some way, so the next level of more mature thinking, morally speaking, maybe I should connect with this student. And then ethical, like, oh, well, what would Medford High actually think about this type of situation? And with the old policy, it was like, oh, no, don't connect with that student because you're not allowed to be even using social media at all. So that would like nip it in the bud right away. But then you still had plenty of instances where students and teachers would, you know, have interactions online. And I started the Twitter account with the permission of the principal. And he knew full well that our policy for, like, you know, didn't allow it, but we just kind of went with it and, you know, saw what came from it. So again, like, you can ask yourself, ask others, and then ask institutions. It's a very reasonable process, very empirical process if the policy is in place for teachers and students to kind of consider these novel situations that happen online every day. So moving on. This is something that happened to me, you know, I would say the first 3 months of managing the Twitter account. Imagine you're a teacher browsing through your Twitter. You see a student's message where they brag about having sex with a fellow classmate using their name. How would you respond? I forgot to mention that in this example, the students were sophomores, so underage, and you know, it was a kind of a jarring situation because you don't think about the sophomores in that way at all. But there they are, just talking about it in this open venue. So what am I supposed to do as a teacher here? First, I think, well, geez, I don't want to talk to the student about this, so personally, I'm just going to ignore it. But then you have to think, oh, you know, I'm a teacher, these students are both in my class, like, I'm sure one doesn't want the other bragging about whatever they're doing in their personal lives in this big public venue. Maybe I have a responsibility to say something, because morally speaking, what that student did on Twitter probably wasn't appropriate. But then institutionally speaking, as a teacher, like, I didn't, at the time, have the backing from the school to then approach those students and say, hey, I saw what you were tweeting about, like, we need to talk about this and resolve it, because it's inappropriate, especially if you're using their name. And then, just to make it extra complicated, I've had a lot of discussions about my friends with this, the two students were underage. And it's a really weird question, like, if two students who are minors have sex, is that legal or not? And, you know, it's really weird to consider, but there is an answer out there. It is in fact illegal. Two minors do not have the ability to consent to sex, so what they did and then posted about technically wasn't appropriate, even legally speaking. And it was great, it just goes to show that our social networks allow for this type of understanding. My good friend Danielle is a published attorney on this matter. Like, this is what she went through obtain her legal degree. It's what she's published in. And she said, you know, Curtis, if this ever happens, even though it's illegal, give this student my contact information, because I would represent them in a heartbeat. Like, it's an institutional part of the law, but, you know, it's something that ethically it's just up in the air. We don't really know what to think about it. So, you know, I just let it slide, and now I use this great hypothetical situation in my presentations, and, you know, that student went on to, I don't know, it all worked out. So nobody wound up on the news, which was always important. Because that's what everyone thinks. Like, teachers who have no experience with social media, like, I don't want to start engaging with students because, you know, I'm going to have my adult content on there. Not that they're posting about their own sex lives, these teachers, but, you know, I have colleagues who post pictures of margaritas like an hour after school lets out on Friday or something like that. It's like, you know, you're probably not sending the best message in the world, but, you know, it's really difficult to talk to these students, talk to the teachers about this stuff without having an institutional framework to rely on, or, you know, a moral framework, or just personally what you think is right or wrong. So, moving on to something a little lighter. Imagine you're a teacher browsing through your Twitter and you see a student tweet. Look up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's the funk Dr. Spock smoking Buddha on a train. How would you respond? This literally happened. It came up. Bye, Mary Beth. So it came up across my Twitter feed, and, you know, obviously they're talking about marijuana, and it's not something that students are supposed to do. They can't advertise their own drug use. Like, it's just wildly inappropriate. So I think to myself, okay, I should probably talk to the student. Then in a moral context, like, you know, the kid is my student, again, I should talk to him. Institutionally speaking, oh, Medford High says no, so it just makes it more complicated. But then, if you think about it a little bit more, it's like, this is my own reasonable process that I'm going through. It's hard to base it on empiricism. If you were to take this quote and look it up online, it's from a Mos Def song. So how can you criticize a student for posting song lyrics online? It doesn't necessarily say that they are engaging in smoking marijuana or anything like that, but it doesn't even necessarily say that they're, you know, a habitual drug user. It's just, you know what, I wanted to post these lyrics, and, you know, if you were to be in a class and learn that you have the right to free speech, then it's like, hey, I should be able to post any song lyrics that I want. So, again, it's just a really complex situation to approach a student about, and that's where you get into the idea of right and wrong. And too many times people think about this in a right and wrong context. At the end of the day, there is no right and wrong, I think, ethically speaking. When it comes up in the synonyms, I try to tell students, don't think of ethics as right and wrong. Think about it as maturity, if you really have to think about it in one particular way. Like, before you posted this, do you think about the consequences on yourself? Yes, I like the song. Did you think about the groups you're a part of? Oh, my classmates really like this song, but my teachers. You probably didn't consider your teachers when you were tweeting. And then the school. No kid considers their school when they're tweeting. Like, it hardly ever happens. But still, it has a consequence on them, and they weren't being mature enough. If you can go to a student and say to them, listen, you're not being mature enough in your Twitter account, it's a lot better conversation starter than saying, listen, what you're doing is wrong online. It's just, it makes a world of difference, and the students are much more open to trying to be mature as opposed to like being in conflict with a teacher about right and wrong. So that's something that's very important. It's not right and wrong. So another workshop that I always go into, again, this is going back to the best presentation that I have, timeline with social media. If we have some time, we can go back to it. But I don't want to get into a long debate or a long presentation on that. But we can go on to the taking the next steps together position. So I'm actually just going to escape because I forgot to queue up the Medford High School student handbook. So just 1 second. Sorry about this, I had plenty of time to do this. Alright, 2014 Educational Opportunities Handbook. That's the best way to look at this. PDF. Feel free to stand up and help yourself to coffee or water outside. I know it is. Is anybody else sweating as much as I am? Alright, so something that every school has is known as an acceptable use policy. It gives the parameters for students and teachers for how they're allowed to use technology in the school, whether it's the school's Wi-Fi, that, you know, Medford High has an open guest network, so anybody can log on to it, to like the literal hardware about, you know, don't download things that might have viruses, like very specific stuff. And last year, it was where the policy said you can't have any social media contact between people, or like really any activity is how it said. Like, they didn't intend to write it that you can't have any social media activity, but that's definitely how it could have come across to anybody. So let's see, find. Oh, did I misspell acceptable? Well, it's at the end, I know that. Oh my goodness, did I download? I didn't. I downloaded the Educational Opportunities Handbook, not the Student Handbook. My goodness. Alright, Medford High School, Student Handbook, something that every student has to agree to before they can even start the day. Like when they walk into homeroom day one, they're handed this student handbook, they're told significant parts of it, and then they have to sign,
75 pages.
75 pages. It's right out of the Apple playbook, It's just like, do you agree to these terms? And now you can go to school here. But before they would agree to these things, not being able to use social media, and, in demonstrating how the Ethics and Public Policy program has helped to serve me and help me, actually develop a career using this stuff, I can show you Medford High's new social media policy. Where is it? I had to go to a number of site council meetings to do this, and then even at the end, they tried to give it to the assistant principals to sneak through, with forbidding social media use. It turned into this whole ordeal. But right here it says, I will act maturely in social media relationships with fellow students, teachers, and anyone a part of our educational environment. Considering these actions and their consequences on the school, academic groups, and myself will be the highest priority. So this is just an institutional footing for students and teachers to now go to whenever they encounter some novel situation that before, they didn't have any real idea on how to approach it. But using this, if you just say, hey, I will act maturely, it becomes a conversation. It's not like someone definitely violated the acceptable use policy. It turns into a conversation that will then lead to an understanding and not necessarily just discipline with a consequence on the student. And that's something that you always want to try to avoid. So this is something that I would advocate really any school trying to adopt because it leads to a workable situation. And yeah, it's directly attributable to my ethics and public policy degree. There's no way I would have been able to come up with this material had I not been in this program. And they definitely wouldn't have taken me as legitimate if I was just some person walking off the street and I didn't have some interesting sounding master's degree in ethics and public policy. That's always something that throws people through a loop. It's like, oh, did you get a master's in education? Yeah, kinda. It's ethics and public policy with a focus in education, and it's the same conversation that I've had numerous times with other teachers and faculty. But it does give you a legitimate, empirical way to say, hey, I know how to help design this, and the site council worked with students and parents and teachers and administrators, and we helped draft this policy. We cleaned up a lot of other little things in here, and now we have something that students and teachers can rely on to help figure out novel situations. So, let's see. Is that supposed to be my relative finale? Not really. So, back to taking next steps together. As great as it was, and it was a very rewarding accomplishment to have policy put into place that I helped design, the state legislature, just this July, proposed new social media policy for, let's see, glad I queued this up. So, this says it shall be unlawful for any employer, then all this information here, but if we go down a bit further, Section 94, it shall be unlawful for any public or private institution providing elementary, secondary, or higher education to, and then it goes into a huge list of social media privacy protection laws. Require, request, suggest, or cause a student or applicant to disclose their username or password at any time. It's like, does that mean I'd be violating a state law now if I tried to friend request a student, or if a student friend requested me? It's just a new policy that luckily has only been approved by the state Senate, and other legislators still have to move it through the process. But this November, we could be dealing with a whole new set of laws that really prevent educators from being able to work with students online. This is almost the version of the policy that says you're not allowed to use social media. And if it happens, who knows what your consequence is going to be. I think it says down here, for every instance, where is it? Right here. So, and any aggrieved student or prospective student, so, anybody who has, yeah, exactly. Every instance, let's see, restraining violations, you're liable for $1,000 per incident. And that's substantial. If you have, just right now at Medford High School, there's over 1,000 students and teachers interacting with each other online. Does that mean we're liable for $1 million just because, we have kids in relationships, not even if anything is going wrong or right? And, this is probably directly attributable to our state legislature overreacting and not being able to put into an ethical context what's happening in social media these days. So if you feel the impetus to write to your congressperson, feel free, because hopefully this type of thing doesn't actually go through. It has just as significant consequences for Suffolk University as it does Medford High School. You guys are, what is it, institution of higher education. I also know that admissions offices are starting to go through students' profiles to check and see like what their habits are. Kids now are not getting into college because of something that they posted on Facebook. But according to this law, that's illegal if it happens to go through in this upcoming session. So it's just going to pose a lot of really interesting situations.
What's illegal?
So it says...
It'd be illegal to look the student up on the internet, or
well,
just be...
So right here, it shall be unlawful, and then it goes into a list of
Right.
anything for higher education, for Suffolk University, or secondary for Medford High School. And if you were to say require, really this comes into play at Medford High if a student does something that is reported by another student, like Tommy comes up to me and says, hey, Bill posted something inappropriate on social media. I would have to go to Bill and say, hey, show me what you put on social media. I need to figure it out. It's causing harm to our educational environment at the institutional level. But now, according to this law, I wouldn't be able to ask him that. He could say, no, Mr. Tuden, I know my rights. If he was a smart enough student, and say, listen, just for that, I could sue you for...
What's the intent of this law? The intent seems to be to prevent people from prying into students' private life online.
Right, and employers. Yeah, that's right. But, I mean, it comes down to as simple as a request. Like, if I request to be a student's friend, is that me breaking the law all of a sudden? And then it goes into stricter language, compel a student. So if there's any type of consequence, like, oh, if you won't show me your social media profile, then I'm just going to suspend you. You can't do that anymore. That's something, that might be a good law, to be honest. Take or threaten any adverse action against the student applicant, including restraining his or her participation in extracurricular activities, so on and so forth. And then it goes on to a list of definitions that, are reasonable. But, according to the Medford High School acceptable use policy, if you access your email account, your personal account, or your business account using the school's infrastructure, so let's say I just check my email on my phone using the school's Wi-Fi, they have a right to look at my email account. That's a part of the acceptable use policy. So if I did anything that was, inappropriate, or, who knows what's in my email account, but that's a really tough situation to put anybody in, and it makes things really inconvenient. But then it also applies to students. I've gone over to a student's computer in the web design course, and it's like, oh, show me, go to the email I sent you last night, and I'll show you the link because it didn't work for him to do his homework or something like that. And he'll pull up his email account, and it's full of porn. What am I supposed to do in that situation? it's really tough. At the time, I just ignored it as if I didn't even see it on the screen, and we went on with the day. But still, these are situations that are coming up, and if one teacher were to be put in that situation, what are they going to do? It could blow up into a huge thing. So, really, we're entering novel territory, and that's why we need to take next steps together. So, practice, and let's see. So, I don't know if we want to begin a discussion around this now. That'd be great. Also, in terms of practice, it was very nice to have Louise Druke, professor for my United Nations class, attend today. And I told her that I would incorporate international relations in some respect. So, as very interesting as it is to talk about proposed policy, if I can just go a bit further and talk about how international relations applies to this, I think there's real potential for connecting students across the world, whether it's from populations that are in conflict or populations that never had contact with each other before. Technology enables all of these really unique and novel possibilities for today. But you need a curriculum and you need a framework for these groups of students to start interacting with each other. So I hope this framework can become the foundation for different groups of students working together online. Because as much as you say that different places are isolated, any Western society theoretically could use this framework. It's all very relatable, and then start to develop relationships online. So where before cultures were hard to come across, now you have a way for students to relate to each other. Because if they're both answering, if a student from the United States and a student from Cuba are considering their actions and the consequences on themselves, and then others, and then institutions, what institutions are you a part of? Who do you consider important groups in your life? Things like that. So it just leads to a very structured way of having two groups of people from very different worlds start interacting with each other. So that's the international relations aspect of it. And I actually have a very unique opportunity coming up in April over April vacation. I get to go to Cuba. So wow. This is something that I'm going to be trying to reach out to other institutions. So all of you who have extensive careers, if you guys have any good English-speaking contacts in Cuba, I wish I spoke Spanish, but you know, I very much appreciate a connection because I am going to be down there for about 7 days. So you know, if we can try to implement a policy or a program like this that just gets kids, you know, you can look at it as a pen pal, basically, that has an ethical foundation behind it.
Go as his
I can go with you and translate. I speak Spanish.
Oh, fantastic. If you have $2,000. But let's see. That's the end of my presentation. So we still have about 15, 20 minutes or so. Yeah.
So what I understand just administratively to sneak ethics into the curriculum in high schools, you have to piggyback onto an existing course.
Right.
You can't have a course in ethics, right? At least not now.
Yeah, Medford High School actually has an elective option for ethics.
Right.
So like, you know, 2 days out of a 6-day cycle, students will go and learn a little bit of philosophy from these 2 English teachers who are passionate about it. But
Okay.
in terms of having a fully developed course load where it's like quarters and it's just as many credits as like your math or science course, yeah, you basically
right.
can't get that at this point. And
So
that's
what
why
you were discussing about the quarter, that's hypothetical right now.
It is, yes.
All right.
So I haven't been able to convince the school to have me teach that class yet. I got hired.
Keep at it.
Yeah.
And I wondered, the one that you said you were the least sure of was quarter 4.
Right.
One thought I had, and just a suggestion, because review and testing may not appeal to the students, and although that ought to be maybe a part, either in the 4th quarter or throughout, it might not be as attractive if that's the declared purpose of a whole quarter.
Right.
So one way to do it would be in terms of media and policy critique. So having them read, as we're doing actually this semester in 701, reading the New York Times, the op-ed page, looking at world events, and using the rubrics you've devised, the readings they've been doing, to analyze what's going on in Syria and with ISIS,
Right.
to read op-eds and get involved in a debate about policy positions. And that could be really interesting to the students because they are interested in current events,
Yeah.
and it's also teaching them media literacy. So that's just my one suggestion. I have to say it's really exciting that you're being this creative and that you're finding little cracks that you can
Yeah, little areas of
move
opportunity.
on
Yeah.
and that actually have a real effect in terms of policy issues rather than just panic in these schools about internet stuff, which they've...
Right, and you know, we're
is-
fortunate to have that Medford High hasn't been put in a big conflict situation yet. But you know, using this policy, should that happen, I think I would be capable of going to an administrator and saying, "Hey, you guys don't know what to do right now, but we happen to have a policy that will lead to a reasonable and empirical solution to whatever the issue is." And
But-
other schools are tied up in that, and they don't know what to do.
What's crucial, and what I think might be a good talking point, is for enabling this 4-quarter sequence, is that if you had it as a class, then what you can say is, look, these are issues that are not amenable to just flat out black and white rules. They're about a conversation with the students. This course gives us a common language to have those conversations with our students.
Right.
And it's important for them to be, critical consumers of the media and anything else out in the world. So it performs multiple functions, but it also allows for that conversation to have an opening in the institution.
Yeah, and that's why I think over the next couple of years, the supplement version of this has the most potential, because you can just put it into a math, science, or history class,
Yeah.
and you start to have this dialogue. So students may be approaching it from a different subject, but at the end of the day, they're all going to be learning about why, reason, empiricism, and consequence, moral, and ethical thinking. So, if I can work with teachers and figure out how they might be able to use this in their own curriculum, because at first when I was designing this, I was like, oh, teachers will love it because they will look at it as a bunch of material that they don't have to design. It's not very strict on grading. They can apply any rubric that they want. and they'll just take it into a class. But what I'm finding is that teachers have so much material that they're required to teach over a school year that it's just asking too much for them to like throw in another 2 weeks of material just to have a common supplement across different subject areas. And it's maybe ironic, I guess, that you talked about not having a full quarter designed around a standardized tests or just results driven. But we kind of have that situation now. We almost have full classes where they spend just a full month or two of the school teaching towards the MCAS, or now Common Core is coming up. And kids at Medford High School, if they didn't do well on an MCAS class, they'll be very strongly advised to take a whole elective course, so they're missing out on an art or a history class that is specialized or something that they would have found more interesting, just so that they could have targeted teaching to taking a test. And then you take that class and you take the test in, like usually it's around April or May, and you're left with the whole end of a year where it's like, oh, well now you don't have to learn anything because you passed the test and now you're done. So it's something that definitely does have to change, and it's just like a whole quarter could really be dedicated to standardized testing, and if that's what it takes to legitimize ethics in a curriculum, like I haven't. It's nice because I haven't gotten any resistance to this. Like teachers talk about time constraints and things like that, but no one thinks that the material itself is illegitimate, which is always nice. So if you can just, it's probably just going to take teachers who are passionate about it and convincing administrators to say, hey, I want to teach a history class, if it's seniors or something like that, and it's going to be ethics all through the school year. Like that's going to be the next big step, and it's just a matter of figuring out where and when that opportunity is going to come from.
Just one quick last word, because other people deserve. You creating a model with demonstrable success will be extremely important for that. So keep it up.
So. Thanks. Regina.
So I think that it's great that finally the school is not just sort of turning a blind eye to social media, because when I was in high school we didn't have social media. But do you have ways to protect yourself as a teacher? Because Facebook, I mean, even if you are very careful with what you're posting, maybe your friends post pictures.
Yeah.
And maybe
luckily my friends, some of them are in the audience now, they have a pretty discerning eye as far as posting pictures goes, so nothing's come back to haunt me.
Or even, I mean, teachers are kind of like celebrities sometimes, where like you just want to know, you have these sort of 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds who are like, I want to know about my good-looking teacher. How do you protect yourself where, even if it's totally innocent?
Yeah, it's hard to find a nice middle ground that's comfortable where you can allow some access but not all access. So like I just kind of go with it and have full transparency. Like my online profiles are fully accessible, like you can see all of my personal information, and every time it's come up in a like day-to-day conversation, it's been fine so far. But I definitely feel vulnerable out there, and teachers who don't want to feel vulnerable at all times, they're left to just completely shut themselves in as much as possible. So it's something that is still in need of development. Like we don't know, like hopefully this policy would allow for it. Like, oh, are you acting like if a student would consider, oh, am I being mature trying to stalk my teacher? Like, someday they might be able to get to that. But again, you can't fault a 14-year-old for not considering institution or even moral consequences of their actions.
Right.
So it's just kind of a gray area that you have to go with. But the most common example is drinking. So teachers, even I post pictures of myself drinking, socially in different situations. My argument is that it's important for students to learn responsible drinking habits from their adults. And if they see, Facebook pictures where, you're around a campfire having some drinks, then that's a healthy thing. But you don't want, people doing cake stands or something, because that's irresponsible behavior. So teachers have to learn how to, protect themselves in that way. But if a teacher is like at a party and it's like, you know what, I'm going to not do this cake stand because the student might find out about it, that's probably not a bad thing.
Right.
Like at the end of the day, a teacher shouldn't feel restricted because they can't do all this lascivious behavior. But it's kind of a nice check on that.
And then also, is there an understanding that, say I'm a student and I post something where like it shows that I'm not being mature, is there an understanding that as my teacher you can come up to me and say, hey, you're posting, like I can see that you're bullying.
Yeah, bullying actually,
thank
you for bringing that up. There's all kinds of bullying legislation out there now where teachers have that ability. They can like force a student to get involved, and even the Medford Police Department has a cybersecurity unit right now, and they can investigate student activity if it is even something loosely based as bullying. It doesn't have to be illegal material. But at the end of the day, it's overwhelming in a lot of ways. Like just managing the school's Twitter account, I'll see pictures of like where students post handfuls of weed, just like in a picture without a caption or anything like that, or like just a smiley face or something. It doesn't have their face in it. You can't really say that that's them. They could have just found this picture online, but you know, most of the time I'm just like, oh, just let it go, just let it go. You know, like I can't deal with this right now. It's too much. And as a registrar, especially, it's not in my job description. And when you bring it to the counselors, they're like, oh, geez, like now I have to spend 5 hours in conference with the student and the parents and then the teachers and the administrators, and now this kid's not going to get into college just because he posted a silly picture or something like that. So it's a big deal. But yeah, it is. Luis, yes.
Great presentation, and thanks
Thank you.
again for all you had during the semester. And
Yeah, it was a blast.
UN
I got to go to the
study
UN
trip
with
to the
Luis and a whole
UN.
bunch of other students. It was
That's right.
awesome.
So that's, you are asking for contact in Havana. I think UNDP would be an obvious place where you want to go and meet with colleagues from the UN.
That's great.
And perhaps there's someone from UNICEF where you can perhaps exchange some views. And before going there, go to the David Rockefeller Center at Harvard University and get Harvard contacts there. They might be able to be helpful. And I really would like to see this very nice presentation at the Harvard Education School of Education. They might be very interesting.
Yeah,
There might be people actually working on this.
Yeah. My schedule's open, so if you guys know venues, I'm happy to bring this little data stick with me anywhere. So yeah, and Luis, I'll definitely follow up with you because I want some advising as far as like PhD programs are concerned and things like that. So I'll definitely be in touch over the next few days, especially for contact info and stuff like that. So thanks for especially being here. Victoria, did you have?
I was just wondering what the process is now when something like that does happen. It's to go to the counselors first, kind of.
Yeah, so in Medford High School, we have 3 assistant principals. One is the disciplinarian, one is like the cuddly counselor, and one is like the day-to-day like management of just student needs, things like that. And that it's not like it's formalized in education, but it's just luckily we have 3 administrators who can assume these roles, and it suits their personalities really well. But if one student has an issue with social media and it goes to the disciplinarian, they're going to get suspended for a week, as opposed to if they go to the other assistant principal, then they're probably just going to get some counseling or something like that. And it is up in the air. Like students will ask to go to a different assistant principal to have their case heard and things like that. But there really isn't a formal process for reporting these things. Now we have this policy so that teachers can kind of think about it if they want to report it. But now they have to think like, oh, which assistant principal am I going to report this student to right now? And at the end of the day, if it comes down to a personal choice, then you're liable for whatever those consequences are, and it's just a lousy situation. So, yes.
I have a question. So, are you, in the future, when you would be teaching this course, if you're allowed to, would you try to kind of teach the students how to use media smartly? Because I do think it's hard to go to a 14-year-old, even a 20-year-old, and be like, do not post a picture of your weed, Yeah. I have a friend that she's a mother, and on Valentine's made a heart out of weed.
Yeah.
It's like, great boyfriend. And I'm thinking to myself, you are a mom, like, in 20 years, maybe this will come back and haunt you, But I do think it's tough that universities do look you up, Google you up, and say, hey, Teresa made this horrible joke back in 2009. We should not accept her. Teresa's me, by the way. But so, are you trying to kind of say, hey, whatever action you do now, it will affect you? And do you think kids are, because you know how when you're a kid, nothing hurts you.
Yeah.
Do you think kids are going to be like, well, in 5 years, this might haunt me back? Or do you think, I guess you put it out there and that's
yeah,
all you can do?
it's covered through the course material, but I feel like kids at any age, and adults at any age, are going to respond to incentives. So if you can figure out a way to make mature behavior an actual incentive for them, then they're much more inclined to take your word for it. And that is especially true when it comes to college applications, because if you can say, hey, some college administrator is going to be looking at your profile, what do you think is going to, what are they going to think when they look at that? Then they're like, oh wow, that's like a huge incentive for me to go back and actually clean up my profile. But we're also dealing with really I've been trying to propose an interesting idea where guidance counselors who work with students to get into colleges, it's tough for them to go and look at a student's profile and help them clean it up, because if they see something bad, it's like, well, now we have to resolve this issue before I can help you clean it up for college or whatever. So the idea of possibly proposing like an amnesty period where it's
It's a good idea.
Yeah, it's controversial because you don't know what you're going to find. Like, what if there's like sexual abuse or something terrible? And it's like, oh, you found that over my social file. I'm supposed to have amnesty or something like that. So that this is what students
Well,
have said in classes.
Right. I know it's complicated.
So.
It's hard, yeah.
So yeah, but that's something that I'm trying to advocate for, like just an amnesty period, so teachers can go back and say, hey, let's clean up all this stuff, no matter what it is. Like we need to make it better. So.
And do you think that at that time, so like high school students, do you think it is good to have that relationship online? You know, I understand the emails because everything is done online, but Facebook, Twitter, I think, you know, like I guess Facebook when I was in high school wasn't
right, yeah,
everywhere. But I would find, at least if I would have, I probably not have a kid right now, I have a nephew, I would say probably don't connect with your high school, but college and later on, I would find acceptable. Isn't it
yeah,
kind of?
a lot of teachers have that rule where it's like, once you graduate, feel free to friend me,
Right.
because then we can have an actual relationship outside of school. But it's really just comes down to the why for your own personal reasons, you know, like, I always like to think like, oh, if I like this student, I should be able to open myself up to them. Like,
Yeah.
you know, there's other students that I don't accept their friend requests because I know they're just going to make fun of me the next day. And I'm an adult, so it's like, jeez, it really makes me feel bad. But,
Yeah.
you know, it's like, I'm just not going to accept that friend request. So it does come down to, you know, the individual level. And as far as addressing kids at a certain age, I think a lot more research has to be done concerning when to like intervene, because kids, you know, you're supposed to be 13 years or older to use Facebook, but Instagram and Twitter, they don't have those types of things, or you know, or if it's like even parents posting stuff about their kids, like how old do you start educating students about this type of thing? And middle schools in the Medford Public School District are very interested in, you know, amending their policies and developing, you know, even course supplements to say, hey, like you kids have to start thinking about this stuff. And even though they're probably still in the moral stage of development, it's like you can target that. Like you can have classes designed about, oh, consider your parents, consider your friends, and like all of these different social media situations.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely out there. It's just, you know, people have to put in the work over the next few years to make it right. So, Professor Platz?
Yeah, please. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the concept of maturity that shows up at all the interesting places in your talk, right? So, be mature. That's the main norm here, right? But somebody is gonna make judgments about was this mature, was this mature, was this mature, and if one superintendent thinks I think that's mature, and the other one no, that's immature. I mean, you gotta have principles packed
Right.
into a concept of immaturity that you can actually spell out and talk about between superintendents and students and teachers. And so what's in there in this concept of maturity?
Yeah, the term maturity in this context comes from strictly the Kohlberg theory. So the idea that people develop along this common process, and that at the end of it, you're an adult that considers the self, the other groups, and then institutions. But even if you're considering institutions, like it doesn't mean that you make a decision that is good for the institution. Like you could say like, oh, adults know the law, but they still break it, and students are going to be very comparable. So honestly, it's tough to say what maturity really means.
Right.
I like to use it with students because if you say to a kid, hey, you're acting immature, like they don't want to be labeled that, especially in front of their peers, or even to another teacher that they, you know, have a relationship with or something like that. It's a word that I think resonates with kids because, you know, any high school kid wants to be mature, like they want to think about themselves in that way. So if you can say, hey, this action that, you know, if it's social media related, I can like show it to your face that you're being immature, then it's kind of a humbling experience, and that's where I find the word really useful. When it comes to like superintendents who, you know, are like, geez, our superintendent, you know, you can't even talk to him about this stuff because he just doesn't want to know. But
it's in the handbook, now they have to, right?
well, he doesn't know what's in the handbook. Like, he wasn't aware of this policy change at the beginning of the school year. It had to go through site council stuff, and really I went to a whole series of meetings to get like parent to teacher and student approval, administrative approval, and then when the handbook was going to print, the person who was sending that document didn't have like the thing that we worked on. Like it was just, they didn't have the PDF or whatever. So they got the assistant principals together and they were like, okay, you guys were there when, you know,
Oh my
we
God,
had those
no
meetings,
way.
and we're just gonna try to figure it out as best we can. And like literally it was 2 days before I went to print and I was like, hey, how's this going? And they're like, yeah, this is what we have. And I was like, oh, thank goodness. It just worked out timing wise because they would have wound up with an even worse policy. So,
Can I say though, you know, seeing that 75-page document that no student's ever going to look at
yeah.
is so shocking. My high school, it was a private school, and it was a crazy school. We had only one rule no roller skating in the hallways. That was our only rule. Now that meant people had to make judgments about what was and wasn't mature, and they were going to, ultimately the headmaster would hold them to account for the equivalent of roller skating in the hallways. But it wasn't 75 pages, it was one ridiculous sentence, but it had a meaning. 75 pages does not have a meaning for any student.
Yeah.
There's something crazy with our society right now.
Yeah, and
I mean, mine might have been crazy too, but I don't know.
yeah, I don't know how you guys made it out of the 70s, let alone our generation making it out of it.
Yeah, well,
So,
the 70s
talked to
were
my father
different.
about that stuff. I was like, wow, you guys, good job making it this far. So, but in terms of like figuring out policy that does work, the Harvard professor Carrie James had a great idea. She's been working on it with her PhD students and graduate students, where they have like a working or living document on display for students to kind of address. So basically, they'll take a policy, put it up, blow it up, and like put it in a big public space like a library or something. And then throughout the course of a year, students come by and read it and post notes about what they think about it. So it's just a way to have like a living document that might better reflect the ideas of what a student is. So I'm hoping to kind of do that later on in the year. So I'll let you know how it goes. I'll let you guys know how all this stuff goes.
I'm sorry, I have to leave. I have to go teach.
Well, we should thank Curtis appropriately. Thank you so much.
Maybe you can propose that for the next student handbook. Just get rid of all 75 pages.
Yeah.
No roller skating.
And roller skating, yeah.
Thanks for coming,
Thank you.
everyone.
Still another question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Do you think that this could be started in the middle school? Because they say a lot of mature or immature behavior already starts in the middle school. And are there middle schools that are trying it yet?
Yes, so right now the middle schools at Medford High, it's like 13 and under, so they really try to rely on the policy of don't have social media relationships still. And that's because most websites have it as their own policy that someone who's 13 or younger shouldn't be using like an Instagram account or a Twitter account, something like that. So whenever some sort of conflict comes up that affects the educational environment, they'll say, listen, you just shouldn't be on this at all. They don't so much address what was said or done on social media. It's like, listen, this is just a wrong that once you get to high school, you'll start to figure out in an appropriate way.
But I mean the whole course.
Yeah, I haven't been in a middle school. I'm sure if I was a substitute in the middle school over the 3 years I was in grad school, this would be much more tailored to it. But I think it has just as much potential.
I think so too.
And we have a very good assistant principal who I had as a science teacher back in the day, and he's very open to developing this stuff. But again, people are super busy at high schools. Like, my goodness, we have advisory periods where 2 times a month students will stay in homeroom for about 45 minutes at the beginning of the day and just learn a lesson. And you know, I wanted to have a social media lesson plan like queued up for an advisory period, and it's like, oh yeah, we can fit you into the schedule in January or something like that. And you know, with a new policy, students should learn about that right at the first day of school. But because there's so much other stuff that they have to get through, it's gonna probably not happen until around January. So it's just a matter of finding time. And since this is such a new thing, and it's too bad because ethics is so underdeveloped, but people just don't know how to accommodate it into their schedules. So it's just going to be a matter of waiting for material to develop at the higher education levels, like colleges and things. It's actually great. Like the Harvard Graduate School of Education, it does tons of stuff ethics-wise. So I think you'll start to see a trickle-down effect over the next decade or so, but that's not going to be without like big consequences for the people who, you know, can't wait that long. So, you know, it's just a matter. Like if you know of a middle school that you care to not have wind up in the news, like I'd be happy to work with them, things like that. But yeah, it's just going to be a matter of time until, you know, it's really developed. Or like, you know, if the state legislature, you know, figures out something and they can develop
Put
rules.
it in the MCAS or something.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things, and you know, we just don't. It's tough to figure out where to start. So, yeah. We good? Ready to go out and enjoy the nice weather? All right. Thanks again for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So, Professor, am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Oh, it's fun. That's fun.
It's okay.
But please call me Jeppe.
What's that?
Jeppe.
Jeppe?
That's my first name and last name.
Everything.
There's a lot of study. There's a lot of fun. And I
Thanks
think
for
good stuff will
coming.
come from it.
It's amazing.
If you ever want to have you back, I'd be happy to talk to more people, especially if Suffolk wants to like talk about this stuff. Before
Yeah,
right.
You're
Just in the sun.
contact person.
Right.
Come to talk about it, the lawsuit.
Spoke to Neil about this. He's on
I know, I wish-
sabbatical, so which is why he's not here.
How come they're delayed?
Yeah.
I'm sitting in.
But yeah, we should set up a meeting sometime in the
nice.
spring. I'm gonna be on leave.
I guess I should. If I want to commit, I'd better read it.
Because I'm in the area, I love conservation.
Yeah.
You know, you guys want to figure out ways to collaborate in the
Both
future.
are just too
No,
bright.
and I think we got to do.
Yeah.
Graduate student who was talking about he wanted to think about teaching high school stuff like that. And I
When we were in that
know
meeting
but maybe I'll.
I was
Students
like,
have
oh,
ethics?
I know why you do well at
So,
sales.
even in
It's
high
like,
school, if he's local,
Okay.
we're hiring.
yeah, like, I was like, I'll buy.
So, you know, I told Georgina, send me an application. This is a job that's out there. You know, ethics about policy
I mean,
is sometimes hard to
even,
figure
like I
out
said,
good path for it,
that
but
whole
teaching, you know, that's
That's a
there's a
difficult.
lot of
It's
work.
always a good experience.
That was,
the university level, so.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
There are levels to the game, but how much is the job? So many questions. Not how it's something you can talk about for hours.
Yeah, like a full course load, like, you know, just tons of material.
All right. All
I'm
right.
now gonna go finish reading.
Oh.
Mike's
I know,
thesis.
I
I
Yep,
think that's what
true.
we're all doing.
We're all doing
There's
that.
like monads going into separate rooms.
We should division of labor. You're taking the first 10 pages.
Oh yeah,
And
okay.
I'm the-
That's not a bad idea.
Then we have a question for each part of it.
Yeah.
That's true. Actually, he's sending his notes to me to print out, so maybe that I can get an idea.
You can just
The
read the
notes.
notes.
It'd be like the start.
And here's the question I don't know how to answer. And you're gonna be. By the way, Mike.
Yeah.
Yes. Hopefully, you don't ask this.
Seriously, good job. What are you up to the rest of the afternoon?
I have to go back to work right now, unfortunately.
Hang out then.
Can you post it, like what you found in Cuba, if they have philosophy or ethics in the
Oh,
high
certainly.
school?
Yeah, I actually, so I videotaped this whole thing,
Yeah.
I released that, and I can make a PowerPoint
Very
presentation.
good. Even better than Vicky's.
I'll get my